30 minutes. Get out of my house. After 21 years, those were the words that finally broke Maya. As the adopted daughter, she was accustomed to their indifference, a familiar chill she'd known since childhood. She was a silent accessory, not a daughter, but she never imagined they would discard her the moment she was no longer valuable, the moment she refused to be sold to save their fortune. Shivering in the rain, publicly shamed and worthless in their eyes, she had no one. Little did they know a Rolls-Royce was turning onto their street. The ultimate story of karma is about to unfold. But what do you believe is the most satisfying revenge for a family like this? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more. In the hallowed halls of the Prescott residence, perfection was a currency, and Maya Thompson was a carefully curated asset. She had been a Prescott since the age of 8, a fact Linda Prescott often recounted at charity luncheons with a tone dripping in self-congratulatory virtue, speaking of giving a less fortunate child a chance. The evidence of this benevolence lined the grand hallway, a gallery of professionally shot photographs where Maya always smiled from the edge of the frame. She was the final, perfecting touch, the quiet testament to their generosity, her dark skin a stark, beautiful contrast to the pale, calculated flawlessness of her adoptive family. The camera loved the story they told, but the house held a different truth. Within its walls, Maya's existence was defined by a silent, grueling rhythm. She was the first to rise, her alarm a soft chime in the pre-dawn stillness, in the last to sleep, long after the final echoes of the family's laughter had faded from the living room. Her hands were intimately familiar with the chill of the kitchen tiles, the heat of the industrial-grade stove, and the endless cycle of laundry that belonged to everyone but her. She was not treated as a daughter, but as a function, a necessary component in the seamless operation of the household. During dinner parties, a small stool near the kitchen doorway served as her designated seat because, as Linda would explain with a tight smile, "The main table is for guests, dear." When Elena, the Prescott's biological daughter, faced trouble at her exclusive private school for plagiarism, it was Maya who was blamed for being a distraction. It was Cole, the youngest, who found the most pleasure in her ambiguous status, often recording her on his phone as she scrubbed floors. He'd hold it up with a smirk, whispering to his online followers, "Look at her, Cinderella version 2025. His taunts a constant reminder that she was of the house, but never of the family. Through it all, Maya maintained a practiced composure, a placid surface on a churning sea of resentment and sorrow. She had learned early that any emotional outburst, any sign of discontent, was immediately branded as ingratitude. So she swallowed the hurt, packed it down into a tight, dense ball in her chest, and perfected the art of being invisible. She had survived for 21 years by making herself small. Her only escape, her only breath of untainted air, was a small, unassuming coffee shop 3 blocks away called The Daily Grind. It was her sanctuary. The moment she pushed open the heavy wooden door, the oppressive scent of Linda's expensive floral perfume was replaced by the rich, earthy aroma of roasted coffee beans. The judgmental silence of the Prescott home dissolved into the comforting symphony of clinking ceramic, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, and the gentle tapping of keyboards. It was a place of quiet industry, of people living lives that were their own. And it was here, in this haven of anonymity, that she had met Aidan Clark. He was a fixture at a small table in the corner, a man she assumed was just another office worker escaping the confines of a cubicle. He had a quiet intensity, his focus often buried in a laptop, but his eyes, when they met hers, were warm and thus startlingly direct. Their relationship had grown from simple nods of acknowledgement to shared smiles, and eventually to quiet conversations over steaming mugs. He never pried or offered unsolicited advice. He simply listened. He listened as she spoke vaguely of a demanding home life, never judging, never pushing for details she wasn't ready to give. He possessed a gentle warmth that was entirely alien to her, a stark contrast to the conditional affection she had always known. With Aidan, she didn't have to earn her place. She just had to be. This secret friendship was the only thing in her life that felt truly hers, a precious treasure she guarded fiercely. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of preparing for one of Linda's impromptu dinner parties, Maya slipped into the chair opposite him, the exhaustion of physical weight on her shoulders. She stirred her black coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the mug. "It's been a long day," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Aiden looked up from his screen, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. He closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "It doesn't have to be a good story. I'm just here to listen." The simple offer caught her off guard. In her world, no one ever asked what she felt. They only told her what to do. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, loosening the tight knot of anxiety that lived there permanently. For the first time all day, a real smile, small but genuine, touched Maya's lips. "Just a lot of work," she said, the words feeling inadequate but safe. "Thank you for asking." He simply nodded, his quiet presence a balm on her frayed nerves. As she sat there, soaking in the brief moment of peace, a fragile, secret glimmer of hope began to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. It was a dangerous feeling, but one she couldn't bring herself to extinguish. The storm began not with rain, but with whispers. It started as hushed, urgent tones seeping from beneath the mahogany door of Richard Prescott's study, growing in frequency and intensity over the course of a week. Maya, accustomed to the house's every mood, felt the shift in its atmosphere. The air grew heavy, charged with an anxiety that had nothing to do with her. While polishing the silver in the dining room, she caught fragments of Richard's frantic phone calls, phrases like catastrophic losses, contract voided, and the one that made her own stomach clench, risk of bankruptcy. She tried to push the words away, to retreat into the numb safety of her daily chores. She knew from long experience that when the foundations of the Prescott empire trembled, the first thing to be sacrificed would be the person with the weakest standing. The inevitable summons came on a Tuesday night. Outside, a torrential rain lashed against the windows, each gust of wind sounding like a mournful howl. Maya was in the kitchen, wiping down the last of the counters, when Linda appeared in the doorway. Her usual placid smile was gone, replaced by a strained, unreadable expression. "Maya," she said, her voice devoid of its usual syrupy sweetness, "we need you in the living room. Now!" A cold dread trickled down Maya's spine. She followed Linda down the long hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. The living room, usually a sterile showcase of wealth, felt like a courtroom. Richard stood stiffly by the fireplace, his face a grim mask. Elena was curled on a velvet armchair, examining her manicure with an air of bored detachment, while Cole lounged on the sofa, a smirk already playing on his lips. But the focal point of the suffocating tension was the man sitting in the center of the room. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a predatory stillness about him. This was Victor Alden, a man whose name was synonymous with ruthless business acquisitions. As Maya stepped into the room, his eyes landed on her, and she felt a visceral chill. He did not look at her as one looks at a young woman. He looked at her the way an auctioneer appraises a prize stallion. His gaze was a cold, methodical inventory, moving from her face down to her feet and back up again, assessing her value with a silent, unnerving calculation. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Richard cleared his throat. He dispensed with any pretense of familial warmth. "Maya," he began, his voice flat and clinical, "Mr. Alden here has made a very generous offer to help the family through a difficult time, an investment that would secure our future." Linda moved to Maya's side, her manicured fingers closing around Maya's arm. The grip was surprisingly strong, a silent warning. "This is your chance to repay us, Maya," she cooed, her voice a poisonous honey. "For everything we've given you. It's an honor, really." Maya looked from Richard's cold expression to Linda's false smile, then to the calculating eyes of Victor Alden. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They weren't talking about a job or a loan. They were talking about her. What is the offer?" she managed to ask, her throat suddenly dry. Richard's gaze was unwavering. "In return for his financial support, Mr. Alden wants you by his side, as his wife." The words struck Maya with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, the room tilted. the faces of the Prescotts blurring into a monstrous collage of expectation and demand. All her life, she had bent, yielded, and endured. She had made herself small to survive. But this was a line she could not cross. A lifetime of swallowed words and stifled emotions surged upward, hot and furious. She pulled her arm from Linda's grasp, the small act of defiance sending a jolt through her. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the dead silence of the room with the force of a thunderclap. She found her voice again, stronger this time. "I won't do it. I'm not a piece of property." Richard's face contorted with disbelief, then rage. He took a step forward, his hand slamming down on the ornate coffee table with a crack that made her flinch. "You don't have the right to refuse," he roared, his facade of civility completely shattered. "This is what we get for our charity, Richard," Linda said, her voice dripping with venom. "Ingratitude." They were closing in on her, their faces a unified front of righteous fury. Panicked and cornered, Maya wielded the only truth she had, the one secret treasure they hadn't yet touched. It burst from her, not as a declaration of love, but as a desperate, final shield. "I can't," she cried, her voice breaking. "I can't, because I'm in love with someone else." The accusation in the room morphed into stunned silence, which was then shattered by a single, sharp sound. Elena let out a short, contemptuous laugh. She uncrossed her legs and looked at Maya with an expression of pure, unadulterated scorn. "In love with someone else?" she sneered, her voice loud and mocking. "You mean that barista from the coffee shop you sneak off to see? Don't make me laugh." Elena's words hung in the air, more brutal than any of Richard's shouts. She had taken Maya's one, precious truth and twisted it into something cheap and pathetic. Maya stood frozen, stripped bare, her only defense dismantled and ridiculed before the cold, unforgiving eyes of the family she had never truly had. Elena's laugh had been a lit match tossed into a room full of gasoline. The explosion that followed was immediate and absolute. Victor Alden, seeing his prospective asset was no longer viable, gave a curt, disgusted nod to Richard and was gone. A silent ghost exiting a house that had suddenly become a war zone. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the last vestige of Prescott's civility evaporated. It was Linda who moved first, her face a mask of cold fury that was far more terrifying than Richard's blustering rage. She stepped toward Maya, her eyes narrowed to slits. 30 minutes, she said, her voice low and chillingly calm. "You have 30 minutes to gather your personal effects and get out of my house." The words were not a suggestion, they were a verdict. Maya stumbled backward, a disbelieving gasp caught in her throat. My house? But where will I go?" The question was a whisper of pure panic, but Linda's expression remained unmoved. "That is no longer our concern," she stated, turning her back on Maya as if she had already ceased to exist. Dazed, Maya turned and fled up the grand staircase, her legs moving on pure instinct. She reached the door to her room, the small, Spartan space at the back of the house that had been her entire world, and fumbled for the knob, a desperate need for sanctuary clawing at her. She had just pulled her old worn suitcase from the top of the wardrobe when the door burst open behind her. Elena stormed in, her face twisted with a vicious, triumphant glee. She lunged for the pile of clothes Maya had begun to place on the bed, snatching a simple blue dress. "This?" she shrieked, her voice shrill. "This was a gift from my aunt. You just got to borrow it." With a savage rip, she tore the fabric down the seam and threw the ruined garment to the floor. Cole followed close behind, his phone already raised and recording. "Get a good shot of this, guys," he narrated to his unseen audience, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "The ungrateful orphan finally gets what she deserves." He panned his camera as Elena moved through the room like a tornado, yanking clothes from hangers, sweeping books from shelves, her rage a performative, destructive dance. "You have no right to take anything," she screamed, throwing a framed photo of Maya's birth mother face down onto the floor, the glass shattering with a sickening crunch. Just as Maya reached for the splintered frame, Linda appeared in the doorway, her presence casting a long, dark shadow into the room. Her eyes were blazing with a righteous fire. 21 years, she hissed, each word a venomous dart. We gave you a name. We gave you a roof over your head, food on your plate. We gave you a life you could never have dreamed of, and you owe us for every single second of it." She stepped closer, invading Maya's space until she was forced to back away. "And now you throw it all away for some worthless, no-name boy from a coffee shop? You ungrateful child. You are nothing." The word hung in the air, final and absolute. Before Maya could react, Cole grabbed her suitcase, a heavy, half-filled thing, and with a whoop of malicious delight, he heaved it through the open second-story window. They dragged her down the stairs, her pleas to be allowed to walk on her own ignored. They were no longer treating her as a person, but as a disgrace to be disposed of. Richard threw open the front door, the storm and the night flooding into the pristine hallway. The harsh glare of the porch light illuminated the scene for the entire neighborhood to see. Drawn by the shouting, curtains were being pulled back in the houses across the street. Richard, ever the showman, stepped out onto the porch, raising his voice to carry over the wind and rain. "Everyone, see this!" he bellowed, pointing a condemning finger at Maya, who stood shivering in the doorway. "This is how the kindness of the Prescott family is repaid. We took in a stray, and she grew into a snake we warmed in our own home." He shoved her forward out into the deluge. She stumbled onto the manicured front lawn, the cold rain soaking through her thin shirt in an instant. A few neighbors, emboldened, had stepped onto their own porches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and morbid fascination. The telltale blue glow of cell phone screens began to pop up in the darkness, each one a silent, unblinking eye capturing her utter humiliation. Her suitcase lay broken on the wet grass, its contents, the meager, tattered pieces of her life, spilling out into the mud. The laughter from her family, the whispers from the neighbors, the relentless rain, it all merged into a deafening roar in her ears. She was trapped in the center of a nightmare, stripped of her home, her dignity, and her past. In that moment of absolute despair, as she stood shivering under the weight of 1,000 judging eyes, her trembling fingers found her phone in her pocket. There was only one number she could think to call. She pressed the screen, her vision blurred by tears and rain. "Aiden!" Her voice was a broken, desperate sob, barely audible over the storm. "Aiden, can you please come? I have nowhere else to go." The line was silent for a beat, and in that terrifying second, she thought he too would abandon her. Then his voice came through, not loud, but a pillar of impossible calm in the raging chaos. "Stay right there," he said, his tone resolute and unwavering. "I'm on my way." The rain was a cold, relentless punishment, plastering Maya's thin shirt to her skin as she stood frozen on the sodden lawn. The world had shrunk to a cruel, claustrophobic stage. On the porch stood her accusers, their faces illuminated in the harsh porch light, models of righteous indignation. Before her, a scattered audience of neighbors, their phones held aloft like votive candles at a vigil for her humiliation. Cole's voice, sharp and gleeful, cut through the storm, narrating her downfall for his livestream. Laughter, whispers, and the steady drumming of the rain merged into a disorienting roar. Maya felt a profound and terrifying emptiness, a hollowing out of her very soul. She was no longer a person. She was a spectacle, an object of scorn, and the tiny flickering hope ignited by Aiden's promise over the phone was beginning to feel like a foolish, desperate dream. Then a sound began to intrude, a vibration felt more than heard. It was a low, resonant thrum that seemed to rise from the very asphalt of the street, a sound of immense and controlled power that did not belong in this manicured, petty world. It cut through the noise, silencing Cole's narration mid-sentence. The neighbors lowered their phones, their curiosity shifting from Maya to the source of the disturbance. Heads turned in unison toward the end of the block. The sound grew, resolving itself into the purr of a finely tuned, formidable engine. From the darkness, a pair of brilliant white headlights sliced through the rain-swept street. A vehicle emerged, gliding with a silent authority that was both menacing and majestic. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, its obsidian black finish seeming to drink the light around it, the rain beating on its polished surface like liquid diamonds. It moved not like a car, but like a predator, sleek and inexorable. It came to a stop directly in front of the Prescott house, its regal presence instantly rendering Richard's theatrical display cheap and pathetic. Behind it, two black SUVs materialized from the storm, parking in a precise, disciplined formation that spoke of practiced security. For a long, stunned moment, the only sound was the rain and the whisper, quiet idle of the Phantom's engine. The entire street held its breath. The rear door opened with a soft, hydraulic sigh. A single, perfectly polished leather shoe met the wet pavement, followed by a figure who unfolded himself from the car's luxurious interior with an unhurried grace. The man who stood up was not the quiet, unassuming office worker from the daily grind. This version of Aidan Clark was clad in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that fit him like a second skin. The rain seemed to hesitate before daring to touch the expensive fabric. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of innate, unquestionable authority, his posture radiating a confidence so absolute it seemed to alter the very atmosphere around him. He didn't look at the gawking neighbors. He didn't spare a glance for the stunned and suddenly nervous Prescotts on the porch. His eyes, intense and unwavering, found Maya immediately, and he began to walk toward her, his steps deliberate and sure on the slick grass. It felt as if a protective bubble had formed around them, the rest of the world and its noise fading into an irrelevant blur. He stopped directly in front of her, his gaze taking in her shivering form, her tear-streaked face, and the ruined remnants of her life scattered in the mud. Without a word, he shrugged off his suit jacket, the movement fluid and powerful. He draped it over her shoulders, and the warmth of his body still clinging to the fine wool was a shocking, grounding sensation. It smelled of him, a clean, subtle scent that was her only safe harbor in the world. He leaned in, his voice a low, private murmur meant only for her, a stark contrast to the public spectacle. "You're okay now," he whispered. "I'm here." That was the final crack in Richard's composure. His authority had been usurped on his own front lawn. Attempting to reclaim his stage, he puffed out his chest and pointed a trembling finger. "Who are you?" he boomed, his voice straining to sound commanding. "You are trespassing on private property. I demand you leave at once." Aidan didn't even flinch. He slowly turned to face Richard, his expression unreadable, but for the cold, hard light in his eyes. His gaze was not one of anger, but of utter dismissal, as if he were observing an insect. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am Aidan Clark." The name dropped into the charged silence, simple and unadorned, yet it landed with the force of a detonated bomb. A collective, audible gasp went through the small crowd of neighbors. Cole's phone, still recording, wavered in his hand. But the most dramatic reaction came from the porch. Richard Prescott's face, which had been red with fury, instantly blanched, his mouth falling slightly open. Beside him, Linda's hand flew to her throat, a strangled sound escaping her lips. "Clark?" she breathed, the name a horrified question. "As in Clark Holdings." The name was not just a name, it was a key to a kingdom they had spent their lives clawing at the gates of, a global financial empire whose CEO was famously reclusive and powerful beyond measure. Richard had spent the last 5 years trying and failing to get a 10-minute meeting with anyone from Clark Holdings' executive board, and now the man himself was standing on his lawn with his arm protectively around the girl they had just thrown out like trash. In that moment, Maya, shivering under the weight of Aidan's coat, watched the foundation of the Prescotts' world crumble into dust. The man she knew as a quiet friend was someone else entirely, and he had just redrawn the map of her universe. The revelation of Aidan's identity sent a seismic shockwave through the assembled crowd, but nowhere did it hit harder than on the Prescotts' porch. The transition was breathtaking in its speed and shamelessness. The fury and contempt vanished from Richard and Linda's faces, replaced by a grotesque pantomime of horrified concern. It was a performance of whiplash-inducing velocity, a desperate pivot from condemnation to damage control. Linda was the first to recover, her instincts as a master manipulator taking over. She descended the porch steps, her movements suddenly fluid and graceful, a saccharine smile plastered across her face as if the previous 10 minutes had been a collective hallucination. She rushed toward Maya, her hands outstretched in a gesture of maternal affection that was nauseatingly false. "Maya, my darling girl," she exclaimed, her voice pitching into the familiar, cloying sweetness Maya knew so well. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, Mr. Clark. We were all just so worried. There's been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." She tried to reach for Maya's arm, to pull her into the fold of their fabricated narrative. "We were just having a small family disagreement, a little spat. You know how tempers can flare. Why don't we all go inside out of this dreadful rain and talk things through?" Before her fingers could make contact, a large, calm presence moved between them. One of the men from the SUVs, dressed in a sharp black suit and wearing a discreet earpiece, had materialized at Aiden's side. He didn't touch Linda, but his position was an impassable, silent barrier. Aiden himself didn't even look at her. His focus remained entirely on Maya, his hand resting gently on her back, a warm, steadying pressure. "There's nothing left to talk about, Mrs. Prescott," Aiden said, his voice calm but infused with a chilling finality that cut through Linda's performance. He turned his gaze to Richard, then to Elena and Cole, who were frozen on the porch like statues in a tableau of their own making. "Maya owes this family nothing. Her association with this place, and with all of you, is over." Each word was a precisely delivered blow, dismantling the Prescotts' last-ditch effort to save face. The surrounding neighbors, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to murmur amongst themselves, the tide of their judgment turning swiftly against the family on the porch. The disparity was too stark, too damning. The cruel public shaming by the people who called her family versus the quiet, resolute protection of the man who was supposedly a stranger. Near the front door, the Prescotts' longtime housekeeper, a woman who had often offered Maya small, secret kindnesses, quickly wiped a tear from her eye, her silent testimony a damning indictment of the years of unseen cruelty. Cole, realizing the live stream was still active and had likely captured the entire catastrophic reversal, fumbled with his phone, his face pale with panic. But it was too late. The view count had already surged into the thousands. Elena, meanwhile, stared at Maya with a look of pure, venomous envy, her eyes fixed on the expensive cut of Aiden's suit and the silent, imposing luxury of the Rolls-Royce. The barista she had mocked was worlds beyond any man she could ever hope to attract. Aiden reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and produced a small, elegant black box. He opened it and presented it to Maya. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single silver key attached to a simple leather fob. "I had this prepared a while ago," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "I had a feeling you might need a place to go one day, a place that was just yours." Tears welled in Maya's eyes, but for the first time that night, they were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. To be seen, to be considered, to have someone anticipate her needs and provide for her safety. It was a form of care so profound and alien, it almost hurt. She took the key, her cold fingers closing around the cool metal. It felt solid and real, a tangible promise of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Aiden's hand gently guided her toward the open door of the Phantom. The interior was a sanctuary of soft leather and polished wood, a world away from the cold rain and the hateful glares. He paused at the door, his eyes searching hers, his expression gentle. "Are you ready?" he asked. It was more than a question about getting into a car. It was a question about leaving behind 21 years of servitude, of being made to feel small and worthless, of surviving on the scraps of affection they threw her way. It was a question about choosing herself. Maya looked past him, for one final time, at the faces on the porch. She saw their desperation, their greed, their sudden, pathetic fear. And she felt nothing. The tight ball of pain she had carried in her chest for so long had finally, miraculously, dissolved. She turned back to Aiden, the man who had seen her when she was invisible. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply gave a single, deliberate nod. It was a nod of acceptance, a nod of release, a nod that closed the door on her past and opened another to a life she was just beginning to believe she deserved. As she slid into the plush seat and Aiden closed the heavy door behind her. The sound was a soft, definitive thud, sealing her inside a new reality and shutting the Prescotts out forever. In the end, Maya Thompson didn't need to lift a finger for retribution. The world, it turned out, had its own unforgiving sense of balance. The karmic debt the Prescotts had accrued over 2 decades came due with an interest rate that was swift and ruinous. Cole's live stream, intended as a monument to his cruelty, became their public tombstone. In the digital age, a story so starkly villainous was irresistible. The video metastasized across the internet, clipped, remixed, and analyzed by an army of online commentators. Hashtags like BILLIONAIRE, Prescott, privilege, and justice for Maya trended for days. The family that had meticulously curated an image of philanthropic perfection was now irrevocably branded as the face of monstrous hypocrisy. The fallout was catastrophic. For Richard Prescott, whose business was already teetering on a knife's edge, the viral infamy was a death sentence. Partners who had been hesitant before were now sprinting for the exits, unwilling to have their corporate names associated with such radioactive toxicity. Contracts were terminated, credit lines were frozen, and the empire, built on a foundation of carefully managed appearances, collapsed under the weight of its own exposed ugliness. They became pariahs in the very social circles they had fought so desperately to dominate. Elena, whose burgeoning modeling career was predicated entirely on a manufactured image of aspirational beauty and grace, found her world incinerated. Brands dropped her overnight. Her agency, flooded with outraged calls and emails, released her from her contract, citing a morals clause. The face she had worked so hard to perfect was now inextricably linked to the sneering cruelty captured in her brother's video. Cole, the architect of their immediate downfall, discovered that the internet never forgets. His name, now infamous, was a red flag on every job application he submitted. The digital footprint he had so gleefully created to humiliate another had become the bars of his own inescapable cage. Maya learned of all this not through obsessive searching, but through the ambient noise of the world, headlines glimpsed on a newsstand or a topic trending on a social media feed. Aiden scrolled through beside her. She felt no triumphant glee, no satisfying surge of vengeance. Instead, she felt a profound, quiet sense of distance, as if she were reading about the misfortunes of strangers in a faraway land. Their world was burning, but she was no longer in it. She was safe. Her new life was built in a place of light. The apartment Aiden had given her was a penthouse overlooking the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed every room in golden sunlight. It was the antithesis of the dark, oppressive opulence of the Prescott house. Here the air was clean, the silence was peaceful, and every object was something she had chosen. The first thing she did was buy a large, ridiculously comfortable armchair and place it by the window, a throne for a queen reigning over a kingdom of her own quiet contentment. For the first few weeks, she fought against the ghosts of old habits, waking with a jolt of panic at 6 a.m. before remembering she didn't have to make anyone's breakfast. She would catch herself about to ask for permission to use the expensive coffee maker before the absurdity of the impulse made her smile. She was unlearning a lifetime of servitude, one small, liberating choice at a time. She found a new purpose, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, meaningful work. She began volunteering at a community center for at-risk youth and children in the foster care system. It wasn't the performative charity of Linda Prescott, designed for a photo opportunity. It was real. She didn't talk about her past, but the kids saw recognition in her eyes, a shared understanding of what it felt like to be on the outside. She helped them with their homework, listened to their stories, and offered the steady, unconditional support she had always craved. She was giving them the one thing the Prescotts had never given her, the simple, powerful gift of being seen. One rainy afternoon, several months after her departure, she was sitting in her armchair, a cup of tea warming her hands as she watched the city lights begin to twinkle below. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Her eyes caught the sender's name, and for a split second, the old, familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Linda Prescott. Her finger hovered over the screen. A part of her, the wounded girl who still lived in the deep recesses of her memory, clamored to open it, to read the words of apology, to savor their desperation, to finally receive the validation she had been denied for so long. She imagined the carefully crafted sentences, the pleas for forgiveness, the self-serving explanations. She held her breath, picturing their ruined world in this pathetic digital olive branch. Then she exhaled. She realized she didn't need to read it. Their apology, if it was genuine at all, was for them, not for her. It was a desperate attempt to cleanse their own conscience, not to heal her wounds. Her healing was already happening, here, in this sunlit apartment, in the quiet moments of her new life. Their validation was worthless. With a sense of calm that felt like the deepest form of power, she slid her thumb across the screen, not clicking delete, but simply marking the message as read and archiving it, consigning it to a digital tomb without ever gracing it with her attention. A few moments later, Aiden came into the room, sensing her quiet mood. He stood behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a soft rumble. Maya leaned her head back against his hand, her eyes still on the sparkling city below. A genuine, peaceful smile touched her lips. She didn't think of the Prescotts, or the email, or the storm she had weathered. Her thoughts were on something simpler, something that was just beginning to grow. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, hopeful clarity, "about what flowers I should plant on the balcony tomorrow. Maybe sunflowers." And so Maya's story comes to a close. A powerful reminder that true victory isn't about revenge, but about finding the strength to outgrow the very people who tried to keep you small. What are your thoughts on her journey? Did the ending bring you a sense of satisfaction? And what moment resonated with you the most? We would love to hear your perspectives in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening and sharing this experience with us. Until our next story, take care.